up until the 1980s, there was a concentration camp for the homeless in South Korea, where more than 600 people died. IT is a tragic story which emerged just a few years ago, and according to some, it has inspired the TV show Squid Game. Today, I want to tell you the sad story of Brothers Home, a welfare center built in South Korea, which between the 70s and 80s had the task of locking up homeless vagrants to re-educate them, even if they were often involved in terrible, deadly challenges for the pure amusement of the superiors. So was Squid Game, a TV series where contestants challenge each other in death games, inspired by these events? Not exactly. The truth is actually far more tragic than we could ever imagine. But to clear things up, we need to start from 1979. In that year, the mayor of Seoul, South Korea, undoubtedly announced that the city would be bidding to host the 1988 Summer Olympics. At the time, the country was under the control of dictator Park In-geun, who did everything he could to secure the win. And that's exactly what happened. In 1981, the International Olympic Committee, as expected, announced that Seoul would host the 1988 Olympic Games. This was a huge event for the country, even though it brought with it a dark side that unfortunately only came to light many years later. The welfare homes. In 1975, a few years before our story, the dictator President Park set up a system of 36 welfare homes spread across the country. In theory, the project was supposed to take in all the undesirables, which mainly meant vagrants and homeless people who, after being re-educated and given a job, would be readmitted into society. This urge to clean up the country grew even stronger as the Olympics approached, since the number of detainees went from 8,600 in 1981 to 16,000 in 1986. It surely was a questionable act, but that's not the point of this video. Among all the centers, there's one that sadly made headlines for the inhumane practices carried out within its walls, the Brothers Home in Busan. Originally established as an orphanage in 1960, this facility was converted into a welfare center in 1975, becoming the largest in the entire network. At its helm was Park In-geun, a former military man and social worker who was supposed to run the center strictly, actually re-educating everyone who came in. But as you might have guessed, things went quite differently. Consider that throughout its operational life, the Brothers Home housed something like 40,000 people, with peaks of 4,000 at the same time, even though the maximum capacity was 500. Why so many people? Simple. The center received significant subsidies from the state. Subsidies that mostly ended up in the director's pockets and were proportional to the number of people detained. So more detainees meant more money. It's estimated that over time, the director managed to stash away, thanks to this veritable concentration camp, a fortune equivalent to more than 90 million euros today. This allows us to explain another aspect, which is that, in fact, less than 10% of the people in prison were actually homeless. Most of them were political opponents and people easy to abduct, like kids waiting for the bus, the disabled, street vendors, and prostitutes. But that's not the worst part. Let's just say that, and later on, this facility gained the name of the Korean Auschwitz. The first thing to know is that the director, to cut costs, decided not to hire competent staff to run the facility, but promoted to guards, some of the most violent prisoners in the center. These privileged detainees organized themselves into teams, creating a paramilitary-style organization. The repression, it's easy to imagine, was a daily occurrence. People often protested because they were jailed without any fault, and everything was handled with beatings, corporal punishment, and abuse. Can you believe that even the kids who were kidnapped were often literally sold abroad? I'll spare you the darker details, but some of the testimony that can be found online make the skin crawl. By the way, the prison director was deeply Catholic. Almost an extremist, I'd say. He even forced all the prisoners to learn Bible verses and sacred songs to pass the time, and here we connect back to Squid Game. The guards also made the prisoners play violent games. for the simple pleasure of self-entertainment, even though I couldn't find any detailed reports that explained what kind of challenges they were. On top of that, all the prisoners wore a blue jumpsuit, which actually is quite similar to what's in the TV series. So this could be a clear source of inspiration for the series, even though, in fact, the director has never explicitly said he used this story as a reference. By the way, guys, these images have been circulating on social media lately. These are made with artificial intelligence, so they're not the real Brothers' home, which was demolished 30 years ago. On top of all this, which is already incredibly serious, there was also exploitation for forced labor, like working in the fields, sewing, and making shoes and bags. Needless to say, almost all of the profits, of course, didn't go to the state or the prisoners, but into directors' pockets. To date, 657 victims have been confirmed, but it's feared that this number is actually much higher. Such a thing, it's hard to keep it secret. The relatives of the people locked up, at least the few who realized where their loved ones were, began to speak up, leading to the arrest of Park In-geun in 1987, specifically for embezzlement and illegal confinement. Do you want to know what's really crazy, though? Being well connected with high-ranking state officials, he was only sentenced to 2.5 years in prison for embezzling millions of dollars in government subsidies. But, incredibly, he was never held accountable for the human rights violations. Anyway, the people, now free, started to protest and speak out about what happened. But officials at all levels ordered them to keep quiet. It was an uncomfortable and embarrassing truth for the government. Can you believe that the truth only started to come out in 2012, thanks to the protests of a survivor who caught the attention of a university professor, who in turn studied the case thoroughly, bringing the corruption to light and pushing the state to compensate the victims and their families. To this day, this remains one of the darkest chapters in South Korean history. Alright folks, thanks for sticking with me up to this point. I started writing this video thinking I was going to make content about the true story of Squid Game. And I actually found myself with a story that's 1,000,000 times more chilling than I could have ever imagined. And I've told it to you, precisely because I believe that things like this should never be forgotten, so they can never happen again. Oh, and by the way, just a little side note to wrap things up. The images we've shown you come from an actual promotional video shot at the time by the prison director to explain to the newly arrived inmates how Brothers' home was managed. This explains why none of the inmates in the video seem to have been beaten, because it was actually a promotional video. In reality, of course, things went down very differently from what you see in the video. If you know any other stories like this, let me know in the comments, and we'll see each other again for another video right here on Geopop, Everyday Science.